a medium. The landscape thinks itself in me, Paul Cézanne is thought to have once said, and I am its consciousness. The painter offers his consciousness to the landscape and, like a stethoscope, amplifies its rhythms. I'll just scroll down so you can quickly see one of his paintings. If you're not familiar with the post-impressionist painter Paul Cézanne, that's one of his paintings. He painted this mountain many, many times. And so take in a little bit what this looks like, because I'm going to talk a bit about how he paints and how he potentially may have thought about painting as he did so. So the painter offers his consciousness to the landscape and, like a stethoscope, amplifies its rhythms. His brushwork too is characteristically rhythmic, as if he allows himself to be vibrated by the antics of the mountains and trees, recording their chatter through the seismograph of his hand. He is no longer the protagonist of his consciousness. The landscape has filled the chamber of his being, which the quotation invites us to imagine as a medium in which the external agency of the landscape can enact itself. The comment reinforces for me what I otherwise intuit when looking at Cézanne's paintings, that those quivering strokes are more than an affectation, more than a mannerism of the times, that they are a methodology for mediating otherness. Locally, each brushstroke seems identical enough to the others. They are not fingerprints, not autographic gestures, but more like an impersonal alphabet of marks, devoid of a personality in themselves. These marks are for the landscape to make of them what it will, by incrementally insinuating itself into the painter's consciousness and vibrating his hand. Their metronomic regularity enable him to remain in a prolonged state of impressionability. The marks are short enough to be iterated quickly, thick enough to sacrifice precision in favour of the whole, and thin enough to retain their malleability. They are translucent enough to be revisited and identical enough to democratize each change, rendering the painting indefinitely pliable. Together, the characteristics of these marks allow Cézanne to mechanize himself, their dimensions setting the frame rate of the landscape's thinking. The brushwork records a methodology of submission. Not unlike the spiritual medium, the artist's own account of the painting process renders him a passive subject to whom something is being done. Cézanne's comment might not merely be interpreted as a poetic turn of phrase about the to and fro dance of perception, but rather a self-reflexive take on impressionism. Does painting render him so impressionable as to become a conduit for a would-be agent, like a landscape? Impressed or expressed is itself one of the guises of the passive versus active question, where expressionism in art historically evokes an agential directionality from inside to outside, right? Expressionism is about projections of an inner state in the artist. Impressionism affords the opposite, letting the outside in. Thinking of an artist as a medium in or through which something takes place seems to suggest a passive mode of authorship. However, there is an ambiguity in this passive-active distinction. Just as Cézanne's landscape is sculpted by geological pressures, the artist that actively expresses only does so through a mind-body apparatus that is shaped by external biosocial climates. If you're taking on the sort of view that art is expressive, it is active, it is coming from somewhere within the artist, you have to remember that the artists are themselves sculpted like a mountain by external factors. So something is happening to the artist, shapes them, life experience, the diet of art that they grew up on, that is shaping the artist such that they express what they express. And then you can look at it the other way around as well. Just as Cézanne must work like a machine and go through pains to position himself passively in the path of impression, right? I was claiming that he's almost like submitting himself to the landscape, making himself almost like a machine that is being used by the landscape to express itself. Even if you take that view, well, the artist that is impressed upon is the architect of his own submission, a decisive actor in the process. So an artist who takes on this role of a medium, which you could think of as more of a sort of passive form of authorship, has actively decided to be passive. So there's a sort of ambiguity between this distinction. And anthropologist Alfred Gell, who wrote a book called Art and Agency, he discusses this ambiguity of the artist state as an agent but also a patient, when he points out that being a patient may be a form of derivative agency. Okay, so patient is simply the opposite of agent. So if an agent is a subject, like in that grammatical sentence, Katarina is drinking coffee, and Katarina is the subject, the active agent that's doing something, and the coffee is an object passively having something done to it, then we could say that the patient is the coffee in that sentence. So a patient is the opposite of an agent. Where an agent is doing something, the patient is having something done to it. The agent is active, the patient is passive. So to read that again, Alfred Gell discusses this ambiguity of the artist state as an agent but also patient, when he points out that being a patient, a recipient, may be a roundabout form of agency. Likewise, being an agent is not a straightforwardly active state either. And here's his example. So we're imagining an artist drawing here when we're reading this quote. He says, "Because one's hand is not actually directly controlled by the visualized or anticipated line that one wants to draw, but by some mysterious muscular alchemy, which is utterly opaque to introspection, the line which appears on the paper is always something of a surprise. At this point, one is a spectator of one's own efforts at drawing. That is, one has become a patient." So that's a really nice way of complicating the agent-patient dichotomy, the active-passive dichotomy that a lot of artists will recognize. I've spoken to my students about this, that when you sit down to draw something, it seems like you're being very decisive and you're about to enact your will on the page, right? You're about to express yourself on the page. But in a way, as soon as you start setting down some marks and you're authoring those marks, you're being the author, the director of what's happening, you are instantly also placed in the position of an audience. You're kind of seeing the work unravel on the page and you're becoming your own first audience. You are the work's first viewer as well as its artist, and you're kind of being affected emotionally by what's happening on the page, just as another viewer or your audience would be. So there is a strange to and fro oscillation in one's experience of agency when you're an artist and you're in the middle of making some work. So that's what Alfred Gell is saying here as an example of how whether you are being an active agent or a passive patient is not always so clear-cut. Most of the time it's not clear-cut. and there's an ambiguity there. So asking whether the artist is passive or active, a patient or an agent, assumes a unidirectional conception of agency, comprising a set of discrete agents either acting or being acted upon, subjects and objects, Katarina's and coffees. However, must these supposedly opposing positions necessarily be mutually exclusive? I mean, let's take that analogy again of me drinking this cup of coffee. I could say that I'm the decisive actor in this situation. I am drinking the coffee. But, you know, is there a way in which the coffee is doing something to me as well? Is making me drink it? Is it exerting its own personality? Although it's not sentient per se, doesn't it also have a sort of will or draw, or even like the way the handle of this cup invites me to grab it? Didn't the cup do that to me? Maybe the issue in this dichotomy is imagining that the direction of agency only goes one way, you know. And in the drawing example, does the direction of agency really only just flow from the artist to the drawing? Or does the drawing start doing stuff to the artist back, so that the drawing exerts its own agency on the artist back? And that was kind of one of the ideas in Alfred Gell's book, Art and Agency. So to go back to the text, must these supposedly opposing positions necessarily be mutually exclusive? The presumed dichotomy between passive and active authorship reflects back to us some dated yet still lingering assumptions about the mechanics of agency, the vectors, topologies, and materialities of selfhood. And I'm intentionally bringing in a little bit of mathematical and physics language there. Okay, let's go to another example. We talked about Cézanne and his painting for a while. Let's talk about T.S. Eliot, the poet. Another example of understanding the artist's role as a medium can be found in T.S. Eliot's impersonal theory of poetry. In Tradition and the Individual Talent, it's an essay that T.S. Eliot wrote, he asks what role, if any, the individual or personality has to play in the process of making art. Here, Eliot argues that the talent of the ideal poet lies not in their ability to pour themselves into their work, but, on the contrary, in their ability to facilitate, in their imagination, the playing out of various ideas without the imposition of their own person. In short, that the best artists took care to remove themselves from the creative equation. As was also the case with Cézanne, the artist appears to be markedly vacant, if not entirely absent, in the act of authorship. The progress of an artist, he writes, is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality, and, quote, it is in this depersonalization that art may be said to approach the conditions of science, end quote. For Eliot, authorship seems to entail a muffling of the self, to make way for other agents to play out their collective will within the space of the poet's mind. A good artist is in this case like a good scientist, impartial, privileging experimental practice and protecting it from the premeditated agendas which might compromise the conditions for discovery. But this self-sacrifice and this extinction of personality sound like quite harsh working conditions, unless there may be something misleading about how we think about persons in the first place. Eliot briefly touches upon this but does not pursue the idea for long. He says, the point of view which I'm struggling to attack, and honestly when you read this essay, it really is true to the genre of the essay, you can really feel him battling through some ideas like, Like they feel like they were really fresh ideas at the time of writing. So he is sort of struggling. You can feel it when you read the text. The point of view which I am struggling to attack is perhaps related to the metaphysical theory of the substantial unity of the soul. For my meaning is that the poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality, in which impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. I kind of love this paragraph because it's actually, in my opinion, really messily written. I don't think it's a very eloquently written paragraph, and it really feels like somebody struggling to say something, like they haven't got the right language to phrase it. And I think nowadays we're much more well equipped to talk about and think about what I think T.S. Eliot was grasping at here. In his essay, T.S. Eliot is trying to resolve an apparent paradox about authorship. How an artist can make something novel, new, out of tradition, old stuff. His solution is to imagine the author as a medium through which tradition is recycled into novel combinations, but is led to wonder, why stop at author? Is a medium in which impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways a conceivable model of self and not only authorship? So is this actually idea about medium something applicable to a theory of self, not just a theory of how art gets made? Is the assumed substantial unity of the soul getting in the way of a better understanding of the mechanics of self? And now we're going to transition into a third example. We'll talk about another artist called Cindy Sherman. So Cindy Sherman, if you're not aware, is famous for taking photographs of herself in which she is staging herself as different characters. So she's embodying many, many different characters, and they're wildly diverse. And she uses set design and costume and performance to really convincingly take on a wild variety of different characters in these photographs she takes of herself. So yeah, you may want to have a little look at her work first before we read on. More recently, Peggy Phelan notes of Cindy Sherman's photographic self-portraits that they allow her to, quote, develop the human body's disappearance into the prop, the prosthesis, end quote, at which point we witness the mise en abîme of self-production and reproduction. And a mise en abîme, by the way, if you don't know, is like that effect you get when you face two mirrors towards each other and there's just an endless reflection. And if you look into one of the mirrors, you'll almost see a mirror inside a mirror inside a mirror inside a mirror till infinity. So Cindy Sherman taking photos of herself again and again as all these different people is kind of disappearing herself into this prop. And as we look into the artist Cindy Sherman, we almost get that effect of seeing a person inside a person inside a person, an endless hall of personality mirrors in a way. Rendering the body as prop or prosthesis recalls the medium's practice of instrumentalizing herself, inviting a self-transformation. In an interview, Sherman describes her process as independent of her own tastes and predilections, evocative of T.S. Eliot's idea of impersonal authorship. When asked whether her characters are a reflection of her own desire to become them, she explains, "When I'm doing the characters, I really don't feel like it's something that grows out of my fantasy, my own dreams. But if not hers, then whose?" Sherman's photographs of herself, taken under various meticulously composed guises, seem to render her at once anonymous and brimming with character. Beyond the bewitching attraction of the humanoid trompe-l'oeil achieved by her miscellaneous disguises, and beyond the exquisite theatricality of these tableaux vivants, is the poignancy of her ubiquity. She is at once everyone and no one. Walking through one of Sherman's retrospective exhibitions, one might squint between photographs but still be left wondering, where is she? By some optical forensic maneuver, one can try to outwit the displays. You know, you can try to outsmart Cindy Sherman. She's pretending to be all these people. She's trying to fool you almost that she's somebody else. So you as the viewer, you can go into her exhibitions, look at her taking on these different characters and try to outsmart her by looking carefully and trying to excavate Cindy Sherman from some latent residue in the photographs. Maybe you'll find a betrayal of continuity across the portraits underneath the layers of dress-up craftsmanship. Maybe you'll see something, aha, but there's this thing that is the same across these disguises, and that's really Cindy Sherman. So you can try play that game if you like. And sure enough, there she is, again and again. But the continuity we extrapolate is not very reassuring, as with each fresh gaze, we only seem to lose her further to a kind of every woman. Tempting though it may be to play this game of catching the artist out and spotting a slip-up in her illusion of becoming other, such a sport would yield only the most unsatisfactory reassurances. A real tooth, a bare leg, an eye, but still no Sherman. This career-long experiment in split-second role-play, for all that is needed for another character to come and replace her is the blink of a camera shutter, recalls the practice of spirit photographers, those ghost hunters who sought in earnest to capture the fleeting form of spirits. So by the way, if you're not aware, spirit photographers, and spirit photography was quite a popular trend in the Victorian era, the practice of trying to go out and use the camera to take pictures of ghosts, the idea being that maybe the camera could capture something that the eye couldn't, could capture spiritual matter, and then there was this eerie idea that when you develop the photograph, something might emerge there that you couldn't see with the naked eye. So it was this idea of uncovering something invisible using a technology, the camera. So Cindy Sherman is also a photographer, photographing herself, so I'm comparing her here to one of these Victorian spirit photographers. So yeah, so what she's doing recalls the practice of spirit photographers, those ghost hunters who sought in earnest to capture the fleeting form of spirits. And although in this sense her task is equally arduous, instead of searching haunted nooks and crannies, Sherman turns the camera at herself, and there, in her living body, finds more ghosts than she could ever hope to discover elsewhere. Beyond the illusions of art and artifice, disguises and the mise en abîme, perhaps greater attention could be paid to the way in which Sherman's condition in her work is enacted in everyday life. If you go to Cindy Sherman's exhibitions, it's really impressive. There's something kind of spectacular about the theatricality of her disguises. There's often quite a lot of makeup and prosthesis and costume involved, and like fake nails and all sorts of things. So behind all that, right, you could start to think about her condition as being this every woman. If you look at it a certain way, we could say that this is all of our condition in everyday life. In a way, all of us are every woman and every man and every people. So the persuasiveness of Cindy Sherman's portraits, however subtle or caricatured, seem to tease the idea that any one self must find itself entrenched in the performativity of always mediating something other, something which comes from outside. What is surprising about the phenomenon of the every person, staged with craftsmanship and artistic discipline in Sherman's practice, is that it can be found beyond art, in the silent permutations of a daydreaming face. Because of this, I sometimes wonder whether Sherman's elaborate disguises are there to help persuade herself rather than us, a kind of ritual for becoming other. In Sherman, the self is staged as nothing but a prop for the task of becoming. I am writing a little bit poetically here, so it helps to unpack it a little bit maybe. The silent permutations of a daydreaming face. In my head I was imagining somebody like, maybe I'm traveling on a train and I see somebody in a seat across the aisle from me and they're just unselfconsciously staring out into space, not aware that they're being looked at. As I will explore further later on, every person seems to hold a potential for alterity, for becoming other, and the way in which they present differently in their lives when they're being unselfconscious or when they're moving between different social groups, something else might come out of them. This possibility of the dynamically different characters people can present in everyday life performs without all this costume and makeup and theatricality, kind of performs what Cindy Sherman's doing in her practice, just in everyday life.